analyst. Good afternoon to friends tuning in from India and greetings of the day to folks joining from across the globe. On behalf of Kurtz International, I welcome you all to this second edition of Urja Samvad, Energy Dialogues for Transforming Rajasthan. Before I begin, just a couple of quick housekeeping announcements, which, given that we are living in a season of webinars, I am sure everybody is accustomed to by now. But it is requested to all participants to please keep their audio and video off, and except for the panelists, because they will be the one which will be also getting into the YouTube video, etc. You may also, for asking any questions, use the chat option, which is at the bottom of your screen. And please send your questions directly to the host, which is by the name Cut Zoom. And then in the Q&A time that is allotted at the end, towards the end of the webinar, we'll take up those questions. If possible, if you can also mention the particular speaker to which you want to direct your question to, it will be a good help. Also, please note that this session is being recorded live and will go to YouTube channel of Kurtz as well. Now coming to the topic of the day and the concept behind starting and curating such dialogues, there's a constant need in the power sector that is being felt to have consulted multi-stakeholder dialogues amongst different stakeholders around different critical issues and contemporary developments that this sector is facing. So at Kurtz, we started curating this series of quarterly webinars, which started with one in June, and this is the second edition that we're doing now, for essentially taking these sectoral developments to the different stakeholders, that is translating the sector for the people and in a bottom-up and consumer-centric fashion. There are various developments that this sector is currently staring at, and Mr. Praveer Sinha of Tata Power had aptly summarized it in the form of 3 Ds. The first one being decentralization of this transition from grid scale to distributed sources of energy. Also decentralization of regulatory power and policy mandates. The second D being decarbonization of the grid and of the generation sphere. And I'm thinking Mr. Rahul Tongia will also be joining us because he has extensively writing on clean coal and in the perspective of decarbonization lately. And the third D being digitalization of the processes through tech-enabled transformations like smart meters and IoT-enabled devices. So now talking about a renewable future for power sector, there are calls for aggressive push towards renewable energy. But again, the intermittency, its potential impact to the grid and its impact on efficiency of existing power plants remain a key concern that needs to be addressed. In that context, Institute of Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, IEFA, which is an Ohio-based organization and also our knowledge partners for this event, have recently come out with a study report on Rajasthan's power sector, basically exploring and estimating the contours of the future of a green recovery pathway for the state's power sector. So we are grateful for Kashish, who is the author of this report, and Mr. Tim Buckley, who's Director Energy Finance at Australasia region at IFA, and for their work as well as their presence and agreeing to be a knowledge partner for this. We are also grateful to the eminent set of speakers that we have here, starting with Mr. Ajitab Sharma, who is the Principal Secretary, Energy Department, Government of Rajasthan, and is an extremely progressive and forward-looking civil servant of the state. We have Mr. Pramod Deo, who is the former chairperson of CERC, that is Central Electricity Regulatory Commission, and is a well-known name in this space. We have with us Dr. Geeta Gauri, who was also incidentally the chair of the previous edition of Urja Samvad that we did with Mr. Suresh Prabhu on Electricity Amendment Act. She's a former member of Competition Commission of India and has also worked in the State Electricity Regulatory Commission of Andhra Pradesh. We have Mr. Gopal Somani, who is a former director of Rajasthan Renewable Energy Corporation Limited, and has done some good research over different types of renewable energy and its prospects in Rajasthan. And we have Sri Hari Prasad Yogi, who is a crusader of consumer voice in the state of Rajasthan and is based out of Savai Madhopur in Rajasthan. And last but not the least, we are also grateful to Mr. Simran Grover, CEO and founder of Bas Research Foundation, for agreeing to be the moderator of this discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to now invite Kashish to start with his presentation and set the tone for this webinar. Over to you, Kashish.
Thanks, Sarthak. Just want to quickly check, am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
All right, thanks. Could you enable the screen sharing option, please? I'd just like to share my presentation.
Is it not
available now? Yes.
Are you able to do it now?
Yes.
Great.
Thank you. All right. So, hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Kashish Shah, and I'm a research analyst with AIFA based in Sydney. Thanks, Sarthak, for giving me this opportunity to present my latest report, which was released today. This presentation is going to discuss some of the key issues and key findings in the Rajasthan's electricity sector. Also, I've tried to model a transformation pathway for Rajasthan over the coming decade by FY 29-30. Why Rajasthan as a research topic? So at AIFA, we see Rajasthan as a key opportunity to power a green recovery from this economic downturn, specifically talking about Rajasthan's renewable energy sector. Rajasthan is arguably India's best solar state. The success of the utility scale solar park of Badla, which is of the size 2.25 gigawatt, which is the largest operational solar park in India. That is the proof of why Rajasthan is a renewable energy leader. So moving on to some of the findings of my presentation. Yes, so let's look at how Rajasthan's electricity sector looks at the moment. So at the end of FY 2019 and 20, in terms of capacity, there is a balance between coal and renewables. So coal formed 45% of the capacity and 56% of the generation, and renewables formed 44% of the capacity and only 18% of the generation. Now, with this immense coal capacity, there is an issue of low utilization rates of 55.2% during the last year, which is quite reflective of the stress in thermal power sector, not just in India, but all across the globe. And with owing to this low utilization rate, we estimate that Rajasthan had to import 10.9 terawatt hours of net electricity, which formed 13.5% of its overall consumption during the last year. Now, looking at the renewable energy capacity, Rajasthan at the moment has 5.2 gigawatt of solar capacity and 4.3 gigawatt of wind power capacity. As I said, Rajasthan is the best solar state in India, and it commissioned the highest solar capacity during the last year, which was of 1.7 gigawatt, slightly ahead of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, which commissioned 1.4 gigawatts and 1.3 gigawatts respectively. In terms of talking about Rajasthan's renewable energy potential, so the CEA's National Electricity Plan estimates Rajasthan's electricity solar power potential to be 142 gigawatts. And as I was talking about the opportunity, at the moment, Rajasthan's only been able to utilize less than 5% of its overall solar potential. In terms of wind, there is 18.7 gigawatt of wind power potential in the state. And further, I would be talking about how this potential could be utilized over the coming decade. Now, let's look at some of the coal-fired power plant tariffs. So if you look at the rightmost column, and if you could look at the pointer, this table has tariffs from 9.3 gigawatts of coal-fired power capacity in Rajasthan, which is roughly 95% of Rajasthan's coal-fired capacity. All of these tariffs are above rupees 4 per kilowatt hour. Now, specifically looking at some of the variable charges of these power plants, Kota and Suratgarh plants has variable charges of 3.1 and 3.6 kilowatt hour respectively, which are 30 to 50% higher than the lowest solar tariff that was achieved in the latest SECI tender of 2 gigawatt solar in June 2020. Now, the collapsing utilization rate and extremely high tariffs of coal-fired power plants has had impact on the DISCOM's performance. So in this chart, we are looking at the two key metrics for the DISCOM performance, that is AT&C losses and the ACS and ARR gap between the period of FY 15-16 and 19-20, which also happens to overlap with the Uday regime. So during the first couple of years, if you look at the ACS ARR gap depicted by the orange line, there was some success in getting the ACS ARR gap down and getting the Rajasthan DISCOMs to a profitable position by 2017 and 18. But then onwards, it has moved backwards, and the ACS and ARR gap has moved up to rupees 1.16 per kilowatt hour. On the side of AT&C losses, there has been progress from an unsustainable AT&C losses of 31.6%. Rajasthan was able to get its AT&C losses down to 22.5%, but yet has not been able to achieve the target of 15% under the Uday scheme. Now analyzing the DISCOM and some of the tariff orders, I've sort of jotted down some of the key reasons behind high ACS and ARR gap. So Rajasthan does not have any material in-state coal mining capacity, which incurs expensive transportation costs of coal, and it also doesn't have the advantage of availability of cheaper hydropower. Now, also during the peak hours, Rajasthan faces power deficit, and that's why it relies on imports from other states or buying expensive power from the open market. Also, there has been no tariff hike since 2015-16, which sort of makes DISCOM's ability to actually get its cost back. And because of that, Rajasthan DISCOMs booked a loss of rupees 6,355 crore, which is nearly $1 billion during the last year. Now, as I said, I'm going to provide, the report provides a macro model for Rajasthan's electricity sector transformation. So let's start with looking at my projections of the electricity demand and production growth. So if you look at the bottommost line, I model Rajasthan's electricity growth based on its GDP growth and electricity demand during the last decade. This trend is going to sustain, and Rajasthan's electricity demand will be growing at 5.5%. But at the same time, the production requirement to suffice this growth in demand will only grow at 4.2%. Now, how Rajasthan could achieve this? Two key aspects: reducing AT&C losses and improving its energy efficiency. Now, in my model, I've incorporated an annual reduction of 1% AT&C losses over the next 10 years. And in terms of energy efficiency, I've been a little bit conservative in absence of any proof or any government specific initiatives on energy efficiency side. So I've only accounted for 0.05% of energy efficiency dividends in my model. Again, talking about energy efficiency and energy intensity of Rajasthan's economy. So in this table, this table is illustrating the share of various sectors in Rajasthan's economy. So as you can see, the orange bars, the service sector is the fastest growing sector in the given period. Rajasthan's service sector share has increased 9% during the given period. So what does this mean for Rajasthan? So the increasing share of the service sector in Rajasthan's GDP implies a decreasing energy intensity. In other words, lesser number of unit of electricity is required to generate an additional value of dollar value of GDP, which is a positive. Now, as I said, talking about transformation, you can see a green splash on this slide. Based on my demand and production model, I've done a bit of supply side modeling. So there is going to be a dramatic shift from coal-fired based electricity system to a renewable based low-cost, low-emission system in Rajasthan. By FY 29-30, this is how Rajasthan's electricity mix would look like. Coal would form 21% of the capacity and 28% of the generation, whereas renewables will form 73% of capacity and 63% of the generation. Now, looking at the capacity numbers over the coming decade, I am modeling about 18 gigawatt of total solar capacity expansion. I've accounted for 15 gigawatt of utility scale solar and 3 gigawatt of distributed solar. Now, I'm aware of the fact that utility scale solar will have its challenging on the grid balancing side. But we've already seen success of utility scale solar in Rajasthan and as well as across India in bringing down the tariffs. So without getting into too much detail, and I'm a finance analyst, I'm not a solar engineer, so I would leave this for the experts to actually find the right balance between utility scale solar and distributed solar in Rajasthan. Another key opportunity for Rajasthan's renewable energy sector is wind repowering. So as I was analyzing the Rajasthan's wind power fleet, more than 60% of Rajasthan wind capacity was commissioned prior to 2010. Now, in the last 10 years, wind turbine technology has grown significantly. So if these older turbines could be replaced with newer, cheaper wind turbines of 2 to 3 megawatt, repowering could optimize Rajasthan's wind power potential. So my model has roughly 22.6 gigawatt of total new capacity additions on the renewable side. Now, in terms of coal-fired projects pipeline, it doesn't look bad at all for Rajasthan. So there are only 1.2 gigawatt of solar, 1.2 gigawatts of coal projects in the planning stage, which I don't think will ever see the day of light given the stress in thermal power sector in India and across the globe. There is a 0.7 gigawatt of coal project that is currently under construction. Now, as I discussed, the expensive nature of the thermal tariffs and the two-part structure of thermal tariffs, which has a massive sunk cost for DISCOMs. Some of these old coal-fired power plants will have to be retired to make way for newer and cheaper renewable energy capacity. So I've identified two coal-fired power projects which will reach its end of life by FY 29-30. And if these could be retired, Rajasthan will have net negative closures of 0.7 gigawatts over the coming decade. And even after that, the utilization rates from an already unsustainable position of 55% will collapse to 41% by FY 29-30. Another view of what will the supply side profile look like. So renewable energy will be catering to all the incremental demand in Rajasthan over the coming decade, and it will also be taking away some of the market share from coal-fired power sector. So that is definitely bad news for coal-fired power sector, but probably good news for, if this is achieved, it would be a good news for the DISCOMs. Now, quickly wrapping up to answer why Rajasthan should transition. Number one, it has an immense opportunity to attract investment into its renewable energy generation as well as related transmission infrastructure. As I said, Rajasthan had to depend on imports from other states or buying power from open market. So if Rajasthan is able to build surplus capacity, it could export and earn some extra revenue through renewable energy export to other states. And it also becomes a model for other states to transition. And number three, this has to be done for the DISCOMs to actually operate sustainably with a profitable position. Now, I have a few quick points for this forum to discuss, and then this could be actually taken forward to be addressed by the policymakers in Rajasthan. Number one would be the retirements of its old coal-fired power plants. Number two will be, there have been some reports about some land tax issue which renewable energy developers are not happy with. Number 3 is solarization of the agricultural demand. And number 4 would be implementation of smart meters to reduce the distribution and commercial losses. And just to conclude my presentation, I think Rajasthan is already a global leader in terms of renewable energy transition. And if the policymakers and the state government stays on track, Rajasthan, I feel confident that Rajasthan will be able to achieve its renewable energy targets. So that's it from me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kashish. If you can just stop the screen share. Yeah. I think that was very insightful, and it did instigate a lot of food for thought for the panel discussion that will now start. I'll hand it over to Simran now. Just a quick announcement before that for ease of communication purposes. Anybody who wants to send in questions, please direct it to Cuts Zoom, which is the host, and we'll take it up in the Q&A session that will be followed. That will be in the last slot of this panel discussion. Over to you, Simran. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarthak, and thank you, Kashish, for that brief and yet very articulate presentation. I'll pick up actually at one of the points you mentioned, Rajasthan being very relevant because it has immense potential for renewable energy. But what I'd also like to point out, it is also relevant for plethora of another reasons. Its geographical closeness to Delhi. It obviously the struggle that DISCOMs are facing in power sector can be reflected across various states across India, including the struggle with the coal transition, of course. And more importantly, per capita income range somewhere in the middle. High domination of tribal and marginal communities, which in many ways are still struggling in terms of 24/7 reliable access. So to sum up, I think Rajasthan is a very vibrant and complex canvas and can be potentially learning ground and potentially influence policy across the state. With this, I'll just like to urge our panelists also to think beyond renewables. Why this dialogue is important is so that we can address some of the fundamental issues that are challenging not just power sector in Rajasthan, but honestly across India, right? And despite renewables becoming increasingly cheaper, some of the inherent issues are becoming barrier to the transition. So let's try to dive deeper into that. And with this, I'd like to invite first Mr. Hariprasad Yogi. Yogi ji, as Sarthak mentioned, is a consumer right advocate based in Savai Madhopur. He's been working on the grassroots for long years. And honestly, when we talk about an energy transition, the discussion about consumers is often missing. So I'd like to take this opportunity to really invite Yogi ji. And Yogi ji, my first question to you is, as a consumer, as an electricity consumer yourself, specifically who resides in a rural part of the country, and also as a consumer right activist, what are the changes that you would like to see in, let's say, next 2 years or next 5 years in Rajasthan in terms of electricity supply, but also the other services that DISCOM is offering to the last mile consumer? Over to you, Yogi ji.
Namaste, Simran ji. Thank you, Sarthak ji. मेरी आवाज आ रही है?
जी सर, we are loud and clear. Thank you.
सिमरन जी, मैं क्योंकि हिंदी में ही बोलूँगा, मैं समझ सकता हूँ, इंग्लिश में बोल नहीं पाता, तो सॉरी चाहूँगा सभी से. चलेगा मेरा हिंदी में?
Sure, sir. I'll try to sum it up in English also once you're done.
ग्रासरूट जो इलेक्ट्रिसिटी कंज्यूम है उसका मैं थोड़ा सा आपको यहाँ डिफाइन कर दूँ. स्पेशली इलेक्ट्रिसिटी एक्ट का जब हम लोग ट्रिबल देखते हैं, वहाँ बिल्कुल क्लियर मेंशन है कि सभी कैटेगरी के कंज्यूमर को इजी भी इलेक्ट्रिसिटी अप्रोच करेंगे. ये प्रीमियर है और कंपनी भी आप देंगे इलेक्ट्रिसिटी एक्ट का जो प्रीमियर है. लेकिन हम लोग अगर एग्रीकल्चर कंज्यूमर की अगर बात करें,
योगी जी आपकी वॉइस थोड़ी अनक्लियर है. मे बी आप अगर वीडियो बंद करें तो शायद वॉइस क्वालिटी इंप्रूव हो जाए. थोड़ा ब्रेक कर रही है.
योगी जी, मे बी बैंडविड्थ का प्रॉब्लम हो, आप वीडियो ऑफ कर लीजिए। हाँ जी, सही है
जी।
ओके, तो प्रिम्बल जो हमारा इलेक्ट्रिसिटी एक्ट जो है 2003, उसका मेन जो प्रिम्बल है उसमें क्लियर बिल्कुल मेंशन है कि एवरी कैटेगरी को इजी अप्रोचेबल आप इलेक्ट्रिसिटी अवेलेबल करवाएंगे, और सेकंड है आप उसे कंपटीशन भी अवेलेबल कराएंगे, आप उसको मोनोपोली से दूर करेंगे। लेकिन अभी जब ग्रास रूट में हम लोग स्पेसिफिक काम करते हैं तो एग्रीकल्चर कंज्यूमर आज भी कई वर्षों से वो क्यू में है, उसकी पेंडेंसी है करीब 5, 6, 7 साल पुरानी। तो मुझे उसे इजी अप्रोचेबल अभी इलेक्ट्रिसिटी अवेलेबल हो नहीं पा रही। तो यहाँ तो हम लोग बात करते हैं सोलर एनर्जी की, वो यहाँ बहुत मैंडेटरी हो जाता है। जिस एरिया में मैं बिलोंग करता हूँ, रणथंभौर का पूरा टाइगर प्रोजेक्ट है, नेशनल पार्क है, तो उसके भी चारों ओर इको सेंसिटिव जोन है। एनवायरमेंट प्रोटेक्शन के उससे सुप्रीम कोर्ट की डायरेक्शन है कि जितना भी आपका ये फॉरेस्ट्री जोन है उसके आसपास कहीं भी आप इलेक्ट्रिसिटी के पोल्स नहीं लगा सकते। तो ऐसे बहुत सारी कैटेगरी है। और स्पेसिफिक मैं बात करूं फिर गवर्नमेंट स्कूल्स की, एज ए वेलफेयर उससे हम लोग देखें तो सारे जो गवर्नमेंट स्कूल्स है वहाँ भी यही प्रॉब्लम्स है। वहाँ पोल्स नहीं पहुंच पा रहे, वायर्स नहीं है, तो उनको भी कहीं ना कहीं लगभग 50%, राजस्थान में लगभग 70,000 स्कूल्स है, गवर्नमेंट स्कूल, उनमें लगभग आज भी 40 या 50% इलेक्ट्रीफाई नहीं है। थर्ड हम लोग बात करें ग्रास रूट की तो CSC और PSC हेल्थ जो सर्विस प्रोवाइडर है, जो गवर्नमेंट के जो CSC PSC बहुत इंटीरियर एरिया में है, तो वहाँ भी इलेक्ट्रीफाई अभी भी हो नहीं पाया। और आंगनबाड़ी केंद्र है, कम्युनिटी हॉल है, पंचायत का जो राजीव गांधी सेवा के नाम से भी काफी, वहाँ भी डिजिटल का कंसेप्ट है, लेकिन बिजली का वहाँ भी अभी इलेक्ट्रीफाई नहीं होने से काफी प्रॉब्लम्स है। और एक जो ग्रास रूट की मैं बहुत बड़ी बात यहाँ सभी पैनल से उस पर ध्यान भी देंगे, बताना चाहूंगा। राजस्थान का जो पिछला हम लोग हिस्ट्री उठा के देखें तो पानी का वाटर लेवल काफी ऊपर था, लेकिन अभी लगभग 5 या 10 साल से वाटर लेवल काफी लो चला गया है। लगभग 400 फीट नीचे अभी वाटर लेवल चला गया। तो उस समय जब वाटर लेवल ऊपर था तब डीजल के पंप सेट इजी वे में पानी को लिफ्टिंग कर लेते थे, वो डीजल पंप सेट से किसान अपना एग्रीकल्चर करते थे। लेकिन अब उनका जो डीजल पंप सेट है वो सारे के सारे वेस्टेज हो गए हैं, और वाटर को लिफ्टिंग करने के लिए अब उनके पास में इलेक्ट्रिसिटी कनेक्शन ही मैंडेटरी हो गया है। तो अब यहाँ जब इलेक्ट्रिसिटी एक्ट में मेंशन है कि आप उनको इलेक्ट्रिसिटी अवेलेबल कराएंगे, तो ये पॉलिसी मेकर के लिए बहुत बड़ा इश्यू है कि आप सोलर एनर्जी को मोटिवेट करें, इन लोगों को इलेक्ट्रीफाई करें, सोलर से ही करें, लेकिन इन्हें इन्हें इलेक्ट्रीफाई करें। तो ये 2-3 चीजें हैं। और इलेक्ट्रीफाई अगर करना है तो सोलर का, मैं जहाँ तक मैं समझ पाता हूँ, सोलर एनर्जी एक बहुत अच्छा अल्टरनेट होगा इनके लिए, और उसमें इजी वे में वहाँ अवेलेबल भी हो जाएगा, एनवायरनमेंट को भी प्रोटेक्शन इसमें मिल मिल जाएगा, क्योंकि ना तो कोई पोल्स लगाने का है ना वायर लगाने का है। तो मैं समझता हूँ कि ग्रास रूट पे अभी ये 3-4 कैटेगरी है, जिसमें नंबर फर्स्ट एग्रीकल्चर है, फिर आपके गवर्नमेंट स्कूल्स हैं, PSC और CSC हैं, वो सब को अगर इलेक्ट्रीफाई करना है, जैसा कि इलेक्ट्रिसिटी एक्ट में मैंडेटरी प्रोविजन है, तो सभी को हम लोग इजी वे में इलेक्ट्रिसिटी करवाएंगे
Right,
अवेलेबल
Yogi.
इलेक्ट्रीफाई।
Yogi, thank you very much. We very much agree with you that we need to power our grassroots infrastructure. Just to sum up very quickly, Yogi ji did mention that it's very much written in the preamble of the Electricity Act that access to electricity to be provided to every consumer. And he raised the issue of pending agriculture connection within Rajasthan. He raised the issue of electricity access for people residing in ecologically sensitive zone in a notified forest where it's not feasible by law to take the wires. And hence solar energy definitely in that context also has a very important role to play. Yogi ji, I've just come very quickly come back to you. I know that you also work for consumers who are already electrified, who are metered by the DISCOM. Just if you can talk about very quickly in 2 minutes, what is the state of electricity consumers in Rajasthan in terms of quality of supply, in terms of services like grievance redressal, etc. मैं क्वेश्चन रिपीट करता हूँ हिंदी में. आप थोड़ा 2 मिनट में अगर बता पाएं कि इलेक्ट्रिसिटी कंज्यूमर की राजस्थान में क्या दशा है, सप्लाई के माध्यम से भी और डिस्कॉम की सर्विसेज के माध्यम से भी, डिस्कॉम की उदासीनता पे अगर आप थोड़ा रोशनी डालें तो हमारे कंज्यूमर, हमारे पार्टिसिपेंट्स को एक अच्छा कॉन्टेक्स्ट मिल पाएगा.
देखिए, राजस्थान का अभी हम लोगों ने पिछले बिल्कुल ग्रास रूट पे स्टडी किया. वो स्टडी रिपोर्ट भी यहाँ अभी सर पैनलिस्ट के सामने हम लोग रख पाएंगे, इतना समय नहीं. लेकिन जो प्रैक्टिकल निकल के आया वो ये है कि सर्विस प्रोवाइडर जो है बहुत ही पुअर कैटेगरी है. इनके पास मेन पावर का भी बहुत ज़्यादा प्रॉब्लम्स है. और सबसे बड़ी जो बात निकल के आ रही है वो इंस्ट्रूमेंट जो है, तो मीटरिंग की हम लोग अगर बात करते हैं तो लगभग 50% मीटर अभी डिफेक्टिव है. उनमें ज़्यादातर मीटर प्रॉपर उनमें मीटरिंग का जो दिखाई नहीं देता बिल्कुल यूनिट वगैरह, या वो बहुत ज़्यादा तेज चल रहे हैं लोगों में, ये चर्चा है. लेकिन सबसे बड़ी बात हम लोगों ने जब प्रैक्टिकल देखा तो वहाँ निकल के आ रहा है बिलिंग जो है, बिलिंग में कुछ और रीडिंग निकल के आती है, और मीटर के अंदर वहाँ फिजिकल जो है मीटर में जब देखते हैं तो वहाँ कुछ और रीडिंग है. जबकि कहा जाता है कि स्पॉट बिलिंग हम लोग करते हैं, तो स्पॉट बिलिंग में बहुत हाई वहाँ पर इन्होंने लगा रखा है. जैसे एग्रीकल्चर का हम लोग उदाहरण दें तो करीब 10 फीट ऊपर सिंगल कनेक्शन, सिंगल फार्मर, अभी एक नई पॉलिसी है राजस्थान में, तो सिंगल कनेक्शन, सिंगल ट्रांसफार्मर, तो ट्रांसफार्मर के अंदर ही अभी मीटर लगे हुए हैं. लगा तो दिए मीटर, बहुत ऊंचाई पे, हाइट पे लगा दिया, लेकिन उनका रीडिंग प्रॉपर नहीं हो पा रही. तो वो जो बिलिंग जो है वहाँ बड़ी प्रॉब्लम है. तो ये एक कॉमन सी बात है और इसको लेकर के लोगों में बहुत जबरदस्त आक्रोश है. लेकिन सर्विस प्रोवाइडर की हम लोग बात करें सेकंड इशू मीटरिंग के अलावा में, तो अभी सबसे जो बड़ी प्रॉब्लम है कि इनके ट्रांसफार्मर, इनके मीटर, इनके वायर, इनके बहुत ज़्यादा लो कैटेगरी के, तो उनसे कंज्यूमर को बहुत लॉसेज अभी है, कंज्यूमर को बहुत हेरेसमेंट हो रहा है उससे. जबकि वहाँ क्लियर है कि 5 ईयर की वारंटी में है, 5 ईयर की गारंटी में है, वो ठीक है. जयपुर डिस्कॉम या जोधपुर डिस्कॉम के कॉन्टेक्ट है, 5 ईयर की गारंटी में है, तो कंज्यूमर को उससे बहुत हेरेसमेंट हो रहा है. उसमें बार बार में लाइट टिपिंग होना, बार बार में पोल्स इनके, थोड़ी भी आंधी तूफान थोड़ा सा भी आता तो पोल्स इनके गिर जाना, फ्यूज वायर का टूट जाना, तो ये बहुत कॉमन अभी है. तो लोगों में अभी ये भी चर्चा है कि आज के जब 20 साल पहले पावर रिफॉर्म शुरुआत नहीं हुए थे, तब शायद काफ़ी अच्छा सिस्टम था, और पावर रिफॉर्म होने के बाद जहाँ इनका सर्विस को बेस्ड होना था, उल्टा काम हो गया. तो ये एक बहुत बड़ा इशू अभी है ग्रास रूट पर, क्योंकि यहाँ 4-4 दिन तक थोड़ा भी अगर आंधी या तूफान आता तो 5-5 दिन तक लाइटें बंद हो जाती. बोलते हैं कि वो पोल्स गिर गए, ट्रांसफार्मर जल गए. तो कहीं ना कहीं इसमें लगता है कि क्वालिटी बहुत ज़्यादा पुअर है जो इंस्ट्रूमेंट ये लोग परचेज अभी कर रहे हैं.
Right, Yogi ji. Thank you very much for raising those points. They are very critical points. Often they seem minor issues, but as Yogi ji pointed out, Discom obviously, and through our experience also, we have often received this feedback that there's a severe shortage of manpower, and not just manpower, well-trained manpower. Along with that, issues regarding quality of infrastructure on the ground, diligence in simple basic core activities such as metering and billing was raised, and of course that links directly to the quality of supply. Ajitabh sir, now I think I am sure you have worked across multiple departments and you are already much aware of the situations, realities on the ground. But we have heard them again from Hari Prasad Yogi. My simple question to you is, especially since you have taken the charge of power sector rather recently, I assume in February this year, and You are also, I believe, leading the fight against COVID on the ground, and you have a deep regards for that. But my question to you is, what is, since now you're in charge, what is your vision for power sector in Rajasthan? And if you can also share some of the key initiatives that government is taking right now or planning right now to address some of the challenges that are addressing consumers as well as the discoms, of course.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, loud and clear.
Okay, so I missed some portion because there was a disconnection for a few seconds. But anyway, so first of all, responding to Mr. Hari Prasad Yogi ji, I think the most of the issues which have been raised by him regarding the consumer dissatisfaction are taken in the right earnest, and I assure of taking all these issues with my field officers, and we'll try to address most of them. But first, responding to the point of agriculture connections which he has raised. So the long pending list of connections. So a brief information that the cutoff date of agriculture connections in the state of Rajasthan for release of collections is still 2012. So the policy decision of the government is that we are releasing agriculture connections only the applications which have been received before the year 2012. So as we are aware that there is a very deep nexus of energy and water, and Rajasthan being a dry state, so we have to keep a strong regulation in terms of the dark zones being notified by the state water resources department and central groundwater department. So it is a policy which is a little bit dynamic, but considering the large number of applications which are being received and the applications and the connections which have been already granted in different groundwater blocks, and certainly the issue of release of tariff subsidy by the government, because as you increase the number of connections, the tariff subsidy which is released by the state government also increases, and it puts in a lot of pressure on the state finances. So for the subsidized connection, there is a long pending list. But as far as the micro and pressure irrigation agriculture connections are concerned, we release them on priority because they save water and consume less electricity because the intensity of irrigation is higher. To Savai Madhopur, out of all 33 districts from which Mr. Yogi ji is representing, is one of the highest theft prone area, electricity theft prone area. So we need to consider that also. But yes, in last 4-5 months, because of strong wind speed and the hailstorm in few areas, particularly in eastern Rajasthan, we face this problem of long duration of disconnection in electricity supply in rural areas, and there were complaints regarding the quality of poles being erected and the construction work of the towers, and I have constituted a committee. So, and this time what I have done is that I have put in an expert from an independent agency, that is this MNIT Jaipur. So one electrical engineer and structural engineer would also be representing in that committee to get the right feedback. Primarily, it seems that what Mr. Hari Prasad ji is mentioning regarding the quality of work is perhaps to some extent correct. So that is one point. Regarding billing issue, spot billing, yes, I am aware. But the recent hue and cry which has occurred in newspaper and media and in other social circles, and particularly in the social media, regarding the high amount of things being released. So I would give only 3 small facts. Like because of the COVID thing, in the month of, that is March, April, May, and June also. So we could not go to the field and at each household and the meter connection area and take the readings. So as per the directions of the regulator, what we did was that we issued the average bill of the previous 4 months, and certainly only in the domestic sector, because everyone was staying at home and children also came back to home, like from outer cities, and colleges were closed and the students also came back to home. And so the electricity consumption, particularly in the domestic sector, increased more than around 25% in aggregate in whole of the state. So the consumption in terms of unit of electricity had increased in domestic connections, A. 2B is that the tariff had increased in the month of February, just a month before the onset of COVID. And 3, the average bills were issued. So finally, when the bills were issued in the month of like July and August, so there was a huge jump. And what happened was that the poor category consumer, they also got shifted to the higher slab in the tariff structure because of their increased consumption. So the tariff rate per unit also increased. So I did some exercise of real-time bills which were issued. So I could trace the bills in which in the corresponding month in the previous year, where the bill was only 800 rupees, it reached up to, in some cases, like 1300. And there was a case where it reached almost to 1800. So it almost got doubled. That is 100% increase. But it was perfectly all right. In terms of merits and objectivity, it was perfectly all right. It was not like that the software system got haywire and the officers in the department or the private contractor which we have hired did something nasty with the whole system. It was not like that. But yes, a lot of financial burden fell upon the consumers, and we came out with a scheme also of allowing the consumers to pay in half installments in 2 different years, like July and August. And subsequently, we also allowed them the waiver in the LPS, that is late payment surcharge. So all these things are there. But coming to the main point of like, what is the vision for the DISCOMs or the power sector? So I think you were wanting to know that, Simran, because I missed your statement.
Right.
So like, first of all, I would like to thank everyone, Cuts and Bask and IFA, and particularly Kashish, because there is nothing left for me to speak and address, because that report is so exhaustive, and this presentation was also quite good, and it contains a lot of statistics about the state of Rajasthan, and almost all the figures and data and the projections which he has given completely matches with our government data also. So that seldom happens somehow. But in this report, I think it is very well drafted, and the way forward mechanism which this report has shown is also quite good. And I'll give it to my officers, both in the state distribution utilities, the generation utility, and the renewable energy corporation, that what all we can sift out of this report and make part of the state policy. Though on most of the points which we are already working, and in totality, as taking cue from what Mr. Hari Prasad ji was also saying, the vision as such, not only as regard to the state of Rajasthan, but in general for whole of the power sector across the country, and which not only includes the state governments and the state government utilities, but it also includes the Ministry of Power and Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, that is MNRE, as well as the central agencies like CEA, and as well as the regulatory authorities like the state regulatory commissions and the central electricity regulatory commission. We should, what I have in my mind and the plan which I have made for the state of Rajasthan, because fortunately I am chairman of the Renewable Energy Corporation, I am chairman of the distribution utilities, I am chairman also of the Urja Vikas Nigam, which is into the power procurement thing, and I am also holding charge of principal secretary energy in the state. So this whole power sector umbrella, at least in Rajasthan, comes under me. So I'm fortunate enough also. And what we are planning, basically, the core idea is that how to make this whole power sector sustainable enough to survive and sustain for a very long time, particularly keeping 3 aspects in mind. One is the society, which is the customer end, the consumer end. Consumer belongs to society. How he is satisfied, how he gets 24/7 quality supply, may it be domestic, may it be commercial, may it be industrial, may it be agriculture. Second aspect is the economic aspect, that this power supply has to be affordable. So like in the state of Rajasthan, the major challenge which we are facing, like if the power purchase cost, when we talk about ACS ARR gap, if the power purchase cost is say like 4.75 rupees, so I am charging almost 9 rupees in certain cases. So I'm charging 9 rupees like from high-end domestic consumers, the NDS consumers, and the industry consumers. So ultimately, this power supply cost, which we call electricity tariff, has to be affordable. So it, even if the high-end consumers are subsidizing it for the low-end consumers, the gap cannot be so much, because ultimately that has to move within a band of plus minus 20% as per the Electricity Act and the old tariff policy also, and the same thing is being included in the new tariff policy also. And the third aspect is the environment issue. So when we mostly talk about the sustainability aspect in any of the sectors, we talk about socio-economic and environmental. So environmental issue is uh, protecting the environment, reduced carbon emission, zero net carbon neutral, whatever we call it. But I add one more thing into it, that is water conservation, because water is also part of our natural ecosystem and it is part of environment. So the deep, because there are a lot of studies regarding water and energy nexus, and particularly very good statistical study has been conducted in Gujarat already, I think around uh, 10 years ago. And because so that is very, very important aspect, because our groundwater aquifers are being drained like anything in certain areas in the country with very low productivity of agriculture production. So when we talk about environment and we link it with the energy sector, so it is not only reducing the carbon emission, but it is also about conserving water. So whatever is the policy, this whole ecosystem has to work in tandem. And the best solution which I see is transition to renewables. It addresses almost all the parameters which are different components of these three different segments. And so I think that is broadly what we are working upon. And then there are a lot of components. If you want me to address right now, it is fine. Or if you want me to address later on, the challenges which we are facing in transition to renewables and the problems which are being faced both operational and financial by the state distribution utilities. There are a lot of issues with the regulator, lot of issues. And I, as a person representing the government, have a lot of issues, and I sometimes keep on fighting with the state regulator, because the regulators also have to come out of their old mindset, because now energy sector cannot be viewed as something like a complete domain of engineers. Fortunately, because I have worked a lot in the water sector also, and fortunately in the water sector, this concept has come out that you cannot be dependent completely on engineers for water management. You have to rope in social scientists, you have to rope in media for advocacy, you have to rope in community to come out with a all set and widespread policy for water management, that is integrated water resources management. The same thing has to enter into energy sector also. We have forgotten completely about the community, the people, the social scientists. So that mindset has to be done away with completely, that is, it is engineers domain. And when we start working on the demand side management and the demand response systems, then only we'll be in a position to make it a sustainable ecosystem addressing all the issues. A lot of things, but we can talk about them later.
Thank you, Ajitab sir. We would have loved to go on into the details, but thank you for eloquently articulating the relationship between very two essential public goods, water and energy. And you also raised the point, I believe, of competition and reducing cross subsidies as well as sustainability. Now, sustainability is a very pertinent issue, specifically in a eco-sensitive geography like Rajasthan. And on this point, even when we talk about renewable energy does require water, does encroach on, or does require land resources. And if some of the recent media articles are to be cited, there is sometimes a conflict between the local communities. Mr. Gopal Somani, I'd like to invite you with this. You are a pioneer of solar and wind and even efficient thermal projects on the ground. I believe you have a lot of practical, technical, as well as on the ground experience. Rajasthan has already commissioned, I think, more than 4 gigawatt of solar capacity. Recent Bridge for India report cites that solar sector in Rajasthan consumes about 60 crores liters of water per year as of 2018. Given that most of the capacity is coming up in areas which are high water stress, do you see there's a potential risk to Rajasthan solar emission, and how can we address this? Mr. Somani.
Mr. Sarthak, Mr. Kassis, Mr. Simran, who have given me a chance to express my views. First, I should congratulate Mr. Kassis, who have prepared a very good roadmap and also brought out the real data about the power sector as a whole in Rajasthan. A very nice presentation. I have ever seen such a beautiful presentation giving the updates and also given a roadmap as well. Let me just start with my career. When I started, I myself got diverted from coal-based energy generation to renewable energy-based generation when it was at nascent stage. It's Rajasthan Renewable Energy Corporation. When I joined in 2000, there was hardly 20 megawatt renewable energy, maybe 10 to 12 megawatt of wind demonstration projects and some rooftop and some demonstration project installed at government buildings in Jaipur for the solar. The coal generation, the thermal generation, including the gas and other things, has been around 3,500 at that particular stage, and only 20 megawatt renewable energy projects were there in the portfolio. This was a grave situation, and because of the high cost of solar equipments like panels, inverters, it used to cost around 17 rupees when first tariff was announced by Central Electricity Regulatory in 2007-2008. So there was also the impact of new Electricity Act, where there was a specific provision of open access and also about some portfolio obligations to switch over to renewable energy with a percentage of maybe 2% or 3% at that particular moment, because the mixed tariff in the basket cannot be brought to such a level, giving more emphasis on renewable energy so that the consumer becomes unaffordable for the average tariff. Anyway, now it is 2020 and we have seen the reversal. At present, if I just go through the data which was presented by Mr. Kasik, the total installed capacity in Rajasthan is around 20,500 megawatt at present. And out of this, 13,280 megawatt comes to the thermal portfolio, and 9,755 megawatt comes to the renewable. So you just see the change which has gone in last 18 to 20 years, that 20 megawatt installation in renewable has gone now to 9,500 and around 10,000 megawatt at present. And if you talk of the percentage share, the 18% of the generation is now switched over to renewable, and only 56% remains with the thermal. So this is a great change. And capacity-wise, if you see, it's almost equal to thermal generation, thermal installation capacity. So now there is a difference. If we install the renewable energy projects like wind, solar, or any other source of renewables, then the capacity utilization factor comes to only 20 to 25%. And whereas the thermal generation, it goes to 80 to 85% of the generation. So even though the capacity of renewable energy has gone to 9,000 or 10,000 megawatt, if we go to just energy available, it is only 20%. So now there is a roadmap available with us. The cost has come down to 2.36 rupees, which is even less than the variable cost in case of thermal power plants. This is a great achievement available for us to switch over to the renewables. The other important point is we don't have the thermal source. We don't have the
Mr. Samani, if I may stop
we don't have the gas,
Mr.
but
Samani,
we have the solar. But we have the solar.
Mr. Samani, the question was not about grid integration of solar. If I may repeat myself, given that most of the renewable projects are coming up in extremely dry areas with high water stress, right? And they're often in conflict with the water and land resources with local community. Do you see it as a barrier for the Rajasthan's solar ambition? And do you have any suggestions how these conflicts, which are not very often but are definitely there, can be addressed?
Sorry, I just gone into the sentiments and started on a different area. But anyway, just to address the issue of let us consider what is the consumption which is there in the thermal power plant and what is the consumption. The solar requires only to clean the panels, and it is almost not more than 2 to 3% of the consumption of water which goes into the thermal. So suppose we just start switching over, and as Mr. Kashish has also put a question, how is the retirement of existing thermal power plants? If we just start thinking on retirement of the thermal power plants, which has already completed their life, maybe 20, 25 years they have already completed. And if we retire those power plants and whatever water is resourced from that particular saving, probably it will suffice for cleaning purpose. The second vast water consumption is carried in the Western Rajasthan, where big projects are coming up, maybe 10,000, 20,000, and now there is a policy in government of Rajasthan itself which predicts that 25,000 megawatt will be developed in a mega scale and 5,000 megawatt will be developed in small scale. 25,000 megawatt will be developed only Western Rajasthan. It will consume a lot of power, a lot of water. So if that particular consumption, that particular installation, it is switched over to the distribution level, each of the 33 kV substation, if it is provided with 500 kilowatt to 2 megawatt or 3 megawatt solar power station, that will resolve the entire segregation of big power plants distributed to the distribution centers, and that will resolve most of the grid issues. And because solar is an intermittent and it cannot run unless there is a storage made available. So far, the transition has taken place because of the capability of thermal power plant to absorb the renewable energy. But further integration of renewable energy won't be possible with the same scenario. We have to look for the storage. Storage cost has already taken a downtrend, and if it is mixed with the 20 to 25% with the storage, definitely this renewable energy, that solar energy, which could be made available within 3 rupees 50 paisa for 25 years. So that is the scenario which has to be brought for the rural area and conserve the water.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Samani, for your comments. You raised very important points, specifically regarding retirement of thermal capacity, not just to open the doors for renewable energy, but also to potentially save a lot of water. I'll definitely come back to that point. But Geeta ma'am, if I can invite you, you have a very unique experience of working with Competition Commission of India as well as Andhra Pradesh Regulatory Commission. Ajitab and Kashish also, I believe, raised the point of competition within the sector. There's definitely a drive from the center as well as within the state to promote more competition within the power distribution specifically. Now, one of the key questions is that are private distribution companies ready to provide power in every nook and corner of the country without the subsidies while taking the business risk? Given that electricity is a public service good, a very essential public service good, not just for comfort of living, but also for livelihoods, for healthcare services, and many other services. Can we just hand it over to the private distribution, and can we carry the risk of failure? Over to you, Geeta ma'am, your comments, please.
Thank you, Simran. And it's good to be part of this group. Pramod and I have met earlier. And of course, what the secretary from Rajasthan said, the Electricity Regulatory Commission can play a very effective role. And each state is very different. So some of the examples I might give to connect it up to the competition issues could perhaps be biased to the southern states. I mean, the problems of Rajasthan state are difficult, as Kashish has made out to in his presentation. But to take up your point, I don't think one should really equate whether it's public ownership or private ownership. It really doesn't matter which one it is, because the question that really comes up is that what are you looking at? What we have done under the Act is that we have given a license for 23 years to both the wires business and the distribution of electricity. A DISCOM combines both the things together. So as a result, what happens is that as the commission members and as being in part of the regulatory reform process, we were always trying to make the DISCOMs viable. And the viability of the DISCOMs then went on to finding out whether competition should come in. Now, competition in a sector like electricity is not between DISCOMs alone. One can work that out because that's what the Regulatory Commission does by setting out various thresholds. They have what is known as a multi-year tariff and say, you have brought down your losses so much and you've done this much and all. And when I look at Andhra, I think we did a remarkable job. Our ATM losses were what we concentrated right in the beginning, brought it down. We were trying to control and we balanced between renewable and non-renewable energy. And when I looked at it and when your letter came and your questions came, I think, has there been any progress? I wonder. Yes, there has. But the progress is very different. And competition should come in by dividing carriage and content. So let us look at it. If the distribution company is only with the wires business and anyone can take power from any source, then it becomes a contract carriage problem. That's the issue that one has to handle, which makes it very interesting because at a broad macro level, it seems very simple, but it's not to be so. Now, let me take it down a little further. If I want to look at it in terms of the new disruption that has come in with renewable energy sources, especially solar, which is what Rajasthan is grappling with, while in Andhra we use wind, solar, and baseload coal plants, some basic things had to be done. First, in the baseload plants, coal plants changed the PPA. We shifted the PPA from 25 to 5 years. We also allowed them to sell open. When it came to the renewable energy sources, you have to again look at it as to what can be done. And I find that the most disruptive thing that has happened is it is possible for everyone to generate their own electricity. And I think in the southern states, this is taking out a lot. In Maharashtra, they've had some amount of success in that. It's just fantastic. And I don't know if any of you noticed, and I brought this up even in my last Urja case, is that there was this fellow who was walking home, must be one of the migrants, and he was walking home with a little solar thing on a little bit of a wooden platform and carrying it. because he could generate his electricity wherever he went. What a remarkable disruption. So when you look at it, let's start looking at agriculture. That's the major problem that one had to work through in Andhra, which is what Rajasthan has to work through. Discoms will invariably inflate their amount of agricultural consumption they take. So if you could have decentralized generation with renewable energy sources, you already have gone a way ahead. And to make people responsible to how much they're going to consume, make them owners of this distributed generation set. Either it could be for a village, it could be for a set of pump sets or for transformers, whatever it is. The next stage then becomes the issue of net metering. We have not been able to get that. I think Rajasthan would like that, because then you can sell some surplus power and take it back and then go ahead again into it, because that requires a lot of grid analysis. And the third thing, which is what you have been pointing out, is the aspect of subsidy and cross-subsidy. How do we handle it? And I knew this was a question that's going to come out, because the whole story of the entire electricity reforms is revolved around this subsidy, cross-subsidy. So I looked at 2-3 things. I'll go through it quickly because we don't have much time. I looked at the new act and the modifications to the new act that has come up, and they still retain the section 42, which is a cross-subsidy surcharge. But if you're going to have decentralized generation, you don't need a cross-subsidy surcharge. The second thing that is very important that one should try and look into it is what should be the tariff that is going to be shared, or what's the tariff that is going to be paid. So when you're having your net metering, then you're already importing and exporting a certain amount of electricity that is coming. But the new draft of the electricity policy does not bring this in. What has been more interesting is 2 days back, the Consumer Rights Act was a draft Consumer Rights Act was put out, which I found that very interesting, because that's a reference as consumer rights that we have to make, where for the first time, there is reference to a word which I haven't heard of earlier called prosumer. That means he's a producer come consumer. Prosumer, it's not a consumer. So when we're talking about a prosumer, we're talking about someone who's already in this business of generating his own power, selling some amount, or taking whenever he requires it. Please remember, renewable energy can be quite tricky at times. Maybe the sun won't come out for a couple of days, or there'll be no wind at all. So you will still have to draw from the grid. And in there, you'll have to work out different grid charges and the outage charges. The point I wanted to, and I liked what Secretary from Rajasthan said, yes, APRC had a huge group of economists. We didn't rely on the engineers. The engineers are good for telling us a few technical things, but they would never get into details of how should one approach these problems. I have talked about the agriculture and the agriculture thing, but they're also the rural and urban poor. They also need electricity. I think electricity is something which is so essential. Although our act doesn't mention it as an essential commodity, it is something that has to be taken up. And the progress that has occurred so far has been slow, but there have been a lot of changes. We have what I call as disruptive power of renewable energy and the disruption that has occurred in redistributive welfare. There has been this kind of shift that is taking place, and we have to rework out the entire electricity scenario thanks to non-renewable energy. But Kashish, you can't let go of base load and coal plants. They are very, very critical to any consumer, and they're very critical to any electricity sector, and the Commission bothers about them. What can be done is that you should be able to reduce the levels, redo the PPAs, and allow for much more fluctuation that is coming through. You can't rely completely on renewable. So let's not get so excited about the environment changes that are taking place. There's a bigger concern that is the question of livelihood and continuing, and coal is still the cheapest in India. Wash the coal. And there's a lot more of corruption in the coal mining, in the transport sector and those than it is there in the question of the electricity sector. Last and final point that I want to talk about competition is that the question of competition in the electricity sector, when you remove the carriage and content, comes through bidding. That's where one looks at it, because what are you bidding for? And the bidding aspect is where competition comes in. And the Electricity Act now talks of enforcing contracts, which is a very, very major thing that has come about. So with prosumer, with bidding, non-renewable disruptive energy, and a different way forward, it may take another 10 years, but it's a long story, and each state is very different. And I'm very careful because I come from a state where we did remarkable. I mean, I think APRC, we did fantastically well, whatever Pramod they might say, but I think we were very good at it. And we managed to bring down our losses. That's what you concentrate on. ATC losses is just theft. We had a special police section and a police station just getting after theft. And then we started looking at how do you combine the two, three together. And now with the question of renewable energy sources, the disruptive energy, the future will again have to be reshaped and rechanged. Maybe the Electricity Act and even the national tariff policy, which doesn't talk very progressively, but has come out with some new ideas that will have to be developed. Let me not be highly technical and be a very good economist in that sense, but these are issues that need much greater depth. Simran, I think I'll stop here. You can, anyone has questions, you can take it up later.
Thank you, Geeta ma'am, for your very practical approach, I believe, to energy transition, and that's why I think we are having a discussion which is, I will say, beyond renewables today. Key takeaways regarding re-engineering of PPA is a very crucial point. Segregation of carriage and content has been vouched multiple times, but of course there has been opposition to the idea from various segments within the industry. We'll definitely come back to this, but even in the proposed amendments of the Electricity Act 2020, we don't see a future towards segregation of carriage and content, and we'll see probably the increase in private investment in the distribution space in forms of franchises and sub-franchises. This brings me to Mr. Deo. As your experience as a regulator, one of the longest stint of 11 years as a regulator, regulating, we have a very mixed experience with privatization in India. Of course, there is an example of DRC and Delhi, where privatization has been a decent success, but we have also have a example of Orissa where it failed. We have example of Mumbai where tariffs are increasing are increasing at a high rate. So given this push towards the privatization, and not a true competition, I will say, in the sense that if within the given area, that private entity will still behave as a monopoly. What is the role of the regulator, and how should the role of regulator evolve?
Thank you, Simran. Now, you asked me specifically about the private sector in distribution, and you are comparing Delhi, then Orissa, and Mumbai. Now, as far as Mumbai is concerned, it was never privatization. Mumbai, historically, what had happened was that up to Mahim Creek, it is with BST, which is a municipal utility, which also runs the bus service. And earlier, electricity sector was cross-subsidizing transport service all over Mumbai city and beyond. And the MERC's first order that when I joined, we disallowed that, and it has been upheld by the Supreme Court. So this was not at all private. Then you come to the BSCS. So BSCS has changed hands. It became Anil Ambani's company. Now Adani had taken over. But very interestingly, BSCS was owned by LIC and GIC. As a joint secretary in 86-88, I was on the board. And later on in 99 to 2001, I used to be also on the board of BSCS. That is the time central government decided to sell the shares to Ambani's. So nothing changed really, because if you see the service which was being provided. Now, as far as Tatas are concerned, they were only supplying to bulk consumers. They were supplying to textile mills, like big consumers like Mahindra, L&T. They were not into retail. Then there is a big issue about when they wanted to go into supplying to some select cooperative society. That created problem. And you will be surprised, part of the Mumbai is also supplied by MSCDCL. Thana is not privatized. It is with MSCDCL, and say like if you take Mulund area, it is with MSCDCL. So if you were to see the tariff going up in Mumbai, is something because they have to buy expensive electricity. You can't buy cheap electricity. You can't generate because whatever is the capacity has been fully utilized. That is the reason. So in fact, the efficiencies, they are quite high. Because if you see the AT&C losses, again, they are very manageable given all the problems that you have with slums. Now, Delhi is a very good example how it succeeded. And it's very interesting when the Tatas got one of the distribution companies. In fact, they took the MSCB engineers because they had no experience of really retail distribution. And the same MSCB engineers, which are very inefficient at MSCDCL, in fact, they really guided how to go about it. As far as other two distribution companies in Delhi are concerned, they were just BSCS which has taken over. They had the experience of Mumbai and which they tried to enforce. And we can see Delhi has been successful. And of course, the credit goes to Sheila Dikshit, how she went about it. And main thing was Delhi and even Mumbai doesn't have to carry the burden of agriculture cross subsidy. So that being the case, Orissa was, World Bank had selected Orissa because Orissa has very low agriculture consumption. And it completely failed for the simple reason they did not realize that low level of rural electrification obviously demanded that there has to be big investment by private sector to go and supply electricity in the rural area. So again, now it was completely taken over by a regulator. They are again trying to give it to private. So this is the example. So the issue comes is that when you talk of the private sector coming, in Rajasthan also, you have got 3 franchises. These are again the big cities. Now question comes is, are we allowing the private sector to come and take over entire, because Rajasthan has those 3 distribution companies and there is a single buyer model. What happens on the single buyer model is that expensive electricity is given where the high-end consumer ratio is more, so that the tariff is equal. So every chief minister wants uniform tariff in his state. And that being the case, this is an issue. When we talk of the prosumer, that's something which has been discussed. And I'm coming to that because this is a very good idea. But the question is, what will happen to the finances of DISCOM? Now, if we were to see that, that itself is the reason why DISCOMs are completely opposed to it. They are sabotaging it. They destroy that. It's only the decentralized electrification where to take place. But we have gone ahead. We have a Saubhagya scheme. We are now supplying electricity. We claim that to all the villages, electricity where the consumers are willing can get it. Ground reality is different. The quality of supply is poor. We may say we have not so much capacity. So unless we can address the issue of political economy of electricity, which is the chief minister. So all these reforms which are being talked about, they cannot happen unless all the chief minister, whether they belong to the ruling party or the opposition party, had to agree. Otherwise, we can go on having, even when we talk about the consumer rights, that is not an amendment to the act. It is under the rule-making power that is being made. And already, say like an MERC, we had made and we have a consumer rights. Comes the question of enforcing them. What is happening is what the central government is trying to do through these rules under the rule-making power is making other distribution companies also to implement them. So that being the case, we are really looking at issue of pilferage. That is something really big. And just now there was a complaint by the consumer, this thing, that from the transformer, they are giving us electricity for agriculture. So you can't steal electricity. Whereas in Maharashtra and Gujarat, what happened is that Maharashtra has 43 lakh pump sets. And so feeder separation was the thing. Since you can't put meters on agriculture, or if you put meters, you can't take a reading. They have been put on separate this thing. But what has happened in the recent tariff, whereas the Prayas and with another statistical institute, they have conclusively proved and MERC has accepted in this tariff order, because MSCDCL was claiming that their T&D losses or AT&C losses have come down to 16%. 15% is the target. Actually, their losses now in this tariff order have been determined as 20.7%, which means agriculture supply was being inflated and those was being passed. So this being the reality, they have been given a trajectory how to do that. So the tariffs across the board have been reduced, but there's a huge cross subsidy coming. And the real problem is Maharashtra government does give money for the subsidy which has to be paid, because Maharashtra, the average cost of supply is nearly 7 rupee 20 paisa, whereas the regulator has fixed tariff is half of that. But finally, Maharashtra government wants that poor farmers are all ministers, MPs, MLAs, Panchayat Samiti members who grow sugarcane and all cash crops. They should get cheap electricity. So the tariff fixed is 1 rupee 50 paisa. 5,000 crore is given directly, and this money is paid. But this money is paid simply because electricity duty, which state government has right to impose, is very high in Maharashtra, which means again the industry and commercial sector and high-end domestic consumers, they bear this burden. And that's why when we talk about Atmanirbhar Bharat, your industry cannot compete with anyone. Forget about China. You cannot compete with anyone. Now, this is an issue which needs to be sorted out by Prime Minister sitting with Chief Minister. Otherwise, we can keep on going on talking about these amendments, going round and round, because all these concepts, we have got the renewable energy for which we have been working. I was the first to set up MEDA in 86. Now, still, we find that prices have come down from 18 rupee tariff. We are talking of 2 rupee 40 paisa. But the question comes is that when you look at the system, power system, it has to be part of that. And the Saubhagya scheme. Now, if you have got 44 lakh already agriculture consumers in Maharashtra, if you are going to add only 1 lakh on the solar pump set, there are not many willing volunteers to go for that. They all want electricity from the grid. So these are the issues, since we are talking about it. So I thought I must raise these issues, because I find that we keep talking about now reducing cross subsidy. But how are you going to reduce this cross subsidy? The tariff will have to go up for whom? It will go up for high-end domestic consumer. Because if you want to reduce the tariff for commercial and industrial, then you can't raise the tariff for agriculture. In that case, it has to come from domestic. So that being the case, now if you allow domestic net metering, that's why the DISCOMs are opposing net metering. And what has happened is that for the now renewable, we have given them holiday from paying the transmission charges. Now those charges finally have to be paid by somebody. So they are getting added to your conventional power, because somebody has to pay for those transmission lines. Now Rajasthan, this entire picture that has been built that we can switch to solar. Question is that who is going to build those transmission lines in Rajasthan? These are interstate lines. So interstate lines are built by the interstate licensing. But if you want to build intrastate lines, the question is that this cost will have to be recovered from, again, it will have to come from your thermal power plants. And if you have got some more hydro coming share, that is how it stands the picture. And smart metering is one last thing. There is no question of smart metering. If you have separate feeders, but if you don't want to take meter reading, you will be surprised when Prayas did this study, and which was done by MERC appointed committee. What they found that these feeders should have automatic meter reading. So sitting here today, we should be able to know how much is being consumed by agriculture on that feeder. But those meter readings are not taken. They are still recording them in register. And that's why from 16%, your AT&C loss is now really 21%. So these are the issues which are very fundamental to the power sector. I think I'll
Thank
stop
you, Mr.
here.
Deo. I'll stop you. Thank you so much. We are really running behind time. We'll just have to jump to some of the questions by the audience. And this question has been raised by Mr. YK Bolia as well as Mr. Somani, and I think to a certain extent by Ms. Geeta. My question is to Ajitab. Ajitab, one of the recent report also in Hindu mentioned that there's a potential 53,000 crore savings that India can have by shutting down old thermal assets. As pointed by some of the panelists and by Kashish also, do you believe there's an opportunity for Rajasthan in just shut down of thermal projects, renegotiation of not renegotiation of PPAs, but re-engineering of PPAs, as Madam Geeta pointed out, and what are the barriers you foresee towards such a transition?
Yeah.
Ajitab, yeah.
Coming straight to the point. So, like Rajasthan, many other states in the country is a power surplus state, one. And most of the around 15 to 16,000 megawatts of installed power capacity is long-term base load PPAs, that is for 20 years or 25 years. So now to get out of those long-term PPAs, because it is a contract being signed, and in a way it is, once the contract is signed, it gets covered and governed more by the Indian Contracts Act and less by the Electricity Act of the year 2003. So there is a legal issue. So now the regulator as well as Government of India MOP has to come out with some kind of dispensation where the states which are surplus in power and are ending up in paying, like for the case of Rajasthan, in the previous year, we paid around more than 2,000 crore rupees as fixed charges for the power plants which were backed down or boxed up because of maybe of the reduced demand or maybe because of the cheap power we could buy from the power exchange and maybe because of the higher installation of the renewable energy power plants. So it is happening again and again. And maybe in the current financial year also, I'll end up in paying more than 1,500 crore rupees against the fixed cost. And as the thermal power plants are backed down, so we all know the per unit cost of electricity increases because the fixed charge you have to pay in any case. So now to come out of it is unless we sit and negotiate across the table. And for that, some dispensation has to be given maybe by CRC or Ministry of Power. We are already in touch with MOP and we have given different kind of models that how to convert those, like for the remaining plant life period of 15-year PPA or 10-year PPA, to get them converted into 5-year PPA or maybe 7 or 8-year PPA into medium-term PPAs. So that needs to be worked out. But what we have done is in Rajasthan, that I have given strict directions and our power generation companies as well as the power procurement company, that is Urja Vikas Nigam, we are strictly following the MOD, the merit order dispatch, come what may. May it be the IPP, that is the private power plants, may it be the state generation companies' power plants, or may it be, for that matter, the renewable energy generators. Though RE generators are must-run generators, they are lowest in the merit order stack and we have to buy power from them. So what we have observed in last 2 years is that if we stick to MOD, so we have to come out of that concept that we have to purchase power from our state companies' generators. So if we come out of that concept, then we save a lot of money doing that also. Ultimately, it is all about reducing the power purchase cost. Two, what we have done is that we have very artistically, through IT-based intervention, started using the short-term market. And Rajasthan is perhaps one of the best performing state in terms of using IEX for fulfillment of the peak demand which arises. Another step which we have taken to reduce the power purchase cost is like what another speaker was mentioning was feeder segregation and solarization of agriculture feeders. And as there is a government's budget announcement also that we'll be giving only daytime supply to the agriculture consumers. So if the distribution utilities plan to reduce that demand supply gap, ultimately it is a whole game of reducing that demand supply gap. If we start reducing that, we will reduce our power purchase cost, which ultimately gets reflected into the ACS ARR gap, and which affects the viability of the state power companies. That is one thing which we are doing, and we have been doing it quite effectively for last 2 years. Another thing, as the mention had come, so ultimately whatever is the renewable potential and whatever quantity in terms of units of energy the state is able to absorb the renewable energy. One thing we have to keep in mind, and we have done a good exercise, though our whole exercise is dependent on a report which has been released by Central Electricity Authority regarding the optimal generation capacity mix. For fulfillment of base load capacity, thermal is going to remain there. One, it is a fact of life. So what is that percentage? That has to be determined. So there has to be a planning for the year of like that report plans for the year 2030. So we have to plan for 2030, 2040 projections for growth of economy and growth in demand, and the additional installation of power generation capacity needed have to be made. So it has to be thermal plus then renewable would certainly be there. And renewable has to be a mix of solar and wind. And whatever anyone claims, there is going to be at least some minimum percentage of curtailment even in the renewable energy. So we say that they have to go must run, and 100% energy they generate, they has to be absorbed into the grid, and the grid integration modalities in terms of the technical advancements and IT enabling has to be to that extent that the curtailment in RE is zero. No, it is not going to happen. So if we are in a position to artistically develop that model for optimizing the technology mix of generation as well as the cost component, because we are getting renewable for 2.55 rupees if we go for the bid like SECI does the bid, and if the levelized cost of tariff is 2.55. But once it enters into the electricity grid, the system level cost is plus 1 rupees. We don't have any kind of study in this country, but international studies show that once the renewable energy enters into the grid, the system level cost is so this 2.55 SECI bidding tariff becomes 3.5 rupees for me. Or if the wind tariff is 2.75, it becomes 3.75 for me once it enters into the grid. Because then I have to upgrade the grid and reactive power and other management has to be done. Right. So another solution is go for distributed generation at the maybe the grid level, or go for grid or sub-grid storage level, or do this exercise holistically for the whole of the state, optimizing the technology component in that whole generation mix and the cost which is incurred in making these new investments, and then decide which thermal power plants I have to retire. And unfortunately, what is happening after this exercise in our state is that most of the state generation company, that is Rajasthan Utpadan Nigam Limited, Kashish has also mentioned about those two different categories, maybe Suratgarh and Kota TPP, that they remains boxed up sometimes, and they have to be even back down below the technical minimum, which has been normatively, which has been decided that this has to be technical minimum for this technology of TPP or thermal power plants. So if so, they have to be back down, then they have to be back down. And the state power plants are the plants which are most severely affected, but ultimately my distribution utility is making money out of it. So that has to be done. And once we decide that and identify those power plants, then there has to be a dispensation, maybe in form of a national policy, or maybe because I know if I retire my Suratgarh thermal power plant or Kota thermal power plant, the Kota TPP, I know in the coming period of remaining plant life period, that is say like 6 to 7 years, I am going to save this much amount, even if I pay them upfront. Now, but who takes that call? There has to be a very clear-cut and transparent policy framework for taking those decisions. And maybe upfront, I bear the capital cost or the financial burden, but in the long run, when it gets levelized, I will earn money. But that is a very difficult call to take at individual's level. And the government of India, MOP, has to certainly rope in its financial resources, and policy initiatives have to be taken. But it is doable. Some of the European countries have very successfully done it, or maybe if we can retrofit these power plants and use them as peaking power, and if we can raise their ramp up, ramp down rates, then in another manner, they can be, gelled well with that concept of optimal generation capacity mix. They can be used there then. But then again, the cost benefit analysis has to be
right. Agreed.
done.
Thank you so much, Aditabh, for your comments. I believe you have thrown a challenge for some of us present in the audience who are researchers and economists. We'll definitely like to take you up on that, and maybe whenever you're available, I know you have a very busy schedule, continue these discussions. But thank you very much for your comments. Before I take the last question and hand over to Tim, I'll also, unfortunately, we are already behind time. I'll request Sarthak to take a note of questions, and if it's feasible and possible, to respond to these questions, touch base with panelists and see if we can respond to those questions. One of the questions that we're taking up is for Kashish, and perhaps Tim can also join in and end with the final comments. The question is on how COVID-19 and economic slowdown will impact a green future, and how can investment and green financing be fostered for enhancing the adoption of clean power technologies. The question is from Abhishek, and I'll hand over to Tim and Kashish if you also want to join in to respond to this question. Thank you very much. I thank all the panelists for joining today. Over to you, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, certainly COVID is proving to be a huge challenge globally, and very specifically a challenge for India with the amount of demand destruction that we are seeing. So without doubt, it is challenging times, but we must embrace the opportunity that brings, and we have to plan for a positive future. And so I think we just need to survive this year and plan and be optimistic and be visionary going forward. So I won't speak for long. Firstly wanted to thank CUTS for hosting such a very interesting discussion, and very, very informative. I'd also like to say, as a foreigner on this call, that Rajasthan, you should be very proud. Rajasthan is now, as Kashish said, moving directly onto the center global stage. It is one of the top states in the world for renewable energy, and the potential is huge, as Kashish has outlined. If you think and embrace the opportunity, it will bring huge energy investments, it will bring employment, it'll bring interstate export opportunities, it'll enhance energy security, it will help solve the water energy nexus problems. And so to me, there are just enormous opportunities here, but it will be disruptive. This is a very, very dynamic, technology-driven disruption. And ultimately, if Rajasthan remains a world leader, you have to be at the front of the technology. You will be bearing and learning as you go. And that's the opportunity, but it will be difficult. Don't get me wrong, there will be challenges in that. But to the point, maybe just finish on the point of technology, we talked, and the Secretary mentioned that we need to add a rupee to the cost of solar. I would leave you with the comment, remember in a decade's time, solar will probably be half the price it is today. So you might be adding 1 rupee for the cost of integration, but you'll be doing it at 1.5 rupees base. That is the opportunity that will drive the disruption and make Rajasthan even more a world leader. And so whilst I accept your point, there will be huge curtailment of solar. I think you have to plan for that, exactly as you said. That's inevitable, but let me leave you with the opportunity that brings. There is a global discussion now that's booming on green hydrogen. And I'll just leave that comment because ultimately, if you have massive solar curtailment, you have free electricity that can be stored through hydrogen or power to X is the more general term, but it'll be green hydrogen. It'll be virtually free. You can then use that for energy store and for firming into the evening peak. So embrace the opportunity, recognize, accept, and be proud that Rajasthan is a world leader and the opportunity is immense in front of you. So thank you for tonight. That was very interesting.
Right. Thank you, everyone. We'll close it now. And for the questions that have remained unaddressed, I'll connect the person who has asked and the person who he has asked over emails, and then maybe the questions can be addressed over emails. Thank you, everyone, for showing up, and have a great day.